We acknowledge that we are on Treaty 6 territory, the gathering grounds of many diverse First Nation, Métis, and Inuit peoples whose footsteps have marked this land and whose presence continues to enrich our vibrant community.
Hello and welcome back to Research Recasted, the Knowledge Mobilization podcast. I'm your host, Kelsey Howlett, and today we are joined by Dr. Tiffany Kriz. Dr. Tiffany Kriz is an associate professor in management and organizations in the School of Business at MacEwan University. She holds a PhD in organizational behavior and a master's and bachelor's degree in psychology. Her research looks at helping individuals and collectives thrive through interdisciplinary approaches with a focus on interpersonal listening. Tiffany is currently collaborating with the Palliative Care Society of the Bow Valley, funded by the Shirk Partnership Engaged Grant, to study the listening-related experiences and training needs of volunteers. Hello, Tiffany. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks. I'm really happy to be here.
Perfect. So I wanted to get started by asking you to explain what interpersonal listening is, because I know that's a large focus of your current research.
Yeah. So it really involves three things. So one is attention, paying attention to the other person, not thinking about other things. So that kind of cognitive component, comprehension or understanding. So showing that you understand what the person's saying. So both what they're saying, what they're actually saying, but also what they're not saying, the underlying layer, the emotional aspect. What does this mean to them? So that's the second component, comprehension or understanding. And then the positive intention toward the other person. So when you have someone who's a really good listener, they are giving you that attention, like you are to me right now. They're showing that understanding. And so that might be through asking relevant questions, knowing what something means to the other person. And then they're having that component of, I care about you. They're showing, and partially through those other, they're giving their attention. But, they're not judging. They're having that environment where you feel that you can just open up like I can with you right now.
Yeah.
So it's those three elements.
Okay. Amazing. And so what kind of inspired your research into this?
Yeah. So I'm in the Department of Management and Organization. So my PhD is in organizational behavior. I have a background in psychology. And I wanted to do something. I wanted to find an area of research where I could really contribute and help to make people's lives better, as cheesy as that sounds. And so when I was in my PhD program, I didn't really know yet what I wanted to study, what my research area was going to be. And I was doing some work on organizational citizenship behaviors. So things that need to be done for the organization that are important for the organization to survive and thrive, but that aren't really part of any one particular person's job. And one of those areas is employee voice. So it's important for employees to speak up at work, share their ideas, voice constructive suggestions where needed to help the organization to kind of continue to evolve and such. So there's a lot of literature on employee voice, but there's not really that other side, the listening aspect. So I came across a quote in a paper where they had done some qualitative research and interviewed people. And this person was talking about why they don't voice sometimes. And they said, well, it's if nobody's listening, then basically what's the point? And so that kind of got me thinking, well, yeah, where are all the papers on listening? We have all these papers on voice, but where's the listening aspect? And around the same time in my own life, I was suddenly around all of these great listeners. I was going through this coaching program. And it was kind of helping to open up my world in a way that I hadn't experienced before. So I saw the importance of listening on multiple levels and saw that there's this need for a conversation around that and for research into that in my field. And thankfully, around the same time, Dr. Avi Kluger at Hebrew University was also trying to start a conversation around listening in the field. And he's a big name. He's done some really important work. And so he was able to kind of get that conversation going and helped me get into that line of research too.
I think working for like a larger organization or a larger like company, I feel a lot of people can relate to the fact that they don't speak up because like where is that going? Like where are your complaints going? Because you don't have like a person that you can sit down and talk to. You're kind of just, you feel like you're just throwing comments out into the void. It's really interesting that you're like, well, yes, people should like stand up for themselves and they should voice their opinions. But we also need to have the other side of that, where we have to have another person on the other side listening to them and actually like understanding what they're saying, which I think is really, really important. But I wanted to ask you, why is this act of listening so important? Like, why is this area of research, like, why does it deserve to be studied, in your opinion?
Yeah, well, in organizations, it's really important, for employee voice, these kinds of things. It's important for people to, on an emotional, cognitive level, their performance as well. There was a recent meta-analysis that came out in 2023 showing that looking at listening in organizations and finding that the relationship between listening and performance was on the level of conscientiousness and performance, which conscientiousness, if you look at personality variables in the big five personality, that's typically the one personality aspect that's most linked to job performance. And so conscientiousness is things like being dependable, organized. So that's something that we know is tied to performance. And this meta-analysis shows that listening is just as important as that, based on the research available. So important for performance, important for humans to grow and thrive and to learn about themselves, to learn about others, to connect. You're not really connecting with other people if there's no listening involved. People can share their stories. You look at social media and everyone's sharing stories, but where's the listening? And people are lonelier than ever. So linked to things like loneliness, which is a huge issue in the world today. We're disconnected from other people. So just on a number of different levels, it's important.
Yeah. I think your point about social media is really interesting because again, that's another place where you're just kind of throwing your voice out into the world and you have no idea how many people are actually like listening as opposed to just watching the video. And it's also really interesting how like that really contributes to like the loneliness and like the detachment that we see. From there, like your work in organizations and management and stuff in the School of Business, your current research focus is on palliative care volunteers and listening for them. And I kind of want to know why or how that shift happened from organizations to palliative care.
Yeah, well, yeah, the major project that I'm currently working on is in palliative care. And it was completely by accident. It wasn't something that I was trying to move into that area. But it really started with, in 2020, my mom had a major stroke. And so she was only 56 at the time. Her work was her life, and she suddenly wasn't able to work anymore. She was paralyzed on half of her body. And so that was a really big thing for her. And I grew up in the US in Nebraska. And so I went down there for a couple of months and helped out right after her stroke when she was adjusting to things. But I couldn't stay there forever. So other people in my hometown in Nebraska had to help out. And so I looked for volunteer opportunities locally and saw that this palliative care association needed some volunteers to do this client-facing work. And so I thought, well, I can't be there with my mom all the time as she's going through this major life change, but I can be there for others and kind of pay it back for those who are able to step in and be there with my mom. So yeah, I reached out and it turns out that they were super excited when they found out that I study listening. So I met with the volunteer coordinator and he's like, well, listening is at the heart of what our volunteers do. And so he asked me to facilitate a training module for them for training volunteers in listening. And I was like, I nervously agreed because I didn't really know anything about palliative care at the time. So I got into that. I started doing the trainings for them. And he also told me that they wanted to kind of be a voice in palliative care and maybe produce some research that would have an impact on other palliative care associations. Yeah, a few years later, we're now doing some of that research, and I ended up getting the SHIRK grant for it. And before that, a SHIRK institutional grant through MacEwan. So we're partnered and looking at the volunteer aspect. So how are volunteers impacted by the listening that they're doing? It can be hard to listen when people are facing this life-limiting diagnosis and it's all these major life changes. There's a lot of negative emotion, and that can be really difficult as a listener. So how do volunteers cope with that? And how do they get over some of their fears, like that it might remind them of their own mortality, and that there's often a fear of not knowing what to say when people are doing these things, and do I try to cheer them up? Do I try to what's the right approach? So just kind of helping people to get past some of that so that they can actually engage and be present with someone else as a listener.
Wow. Firstly, paying it forward and like all of that for your mom is just such a beautiful thing that you've done. So thank you for that. Can you walk us through a little bit about this training module and how you're helping these, and like how you help these volunteers? Like what steps do they need to take in order to become a better listener in these situations?
Yeah, well, a lot of it comes on reflecting on their own listening experiences. Paying attention to who are those people in their life who've been a good listener for them and who've showed up, and what did that look like? That experiential aspect is something that can be really helpful, and this is something I do in teaching, is like have students reflect on their own experiences, because that's a good basis for learning. So some of it is that, and then thinking about the times when people wanted a good listener and they didn't have access to a good listener, and what was lacking there. Maybe someone tried, they had good intentions in listening to them, but they didn't kind of come through as a listener in the way that they needed in the moment. So what went into that? So reflecting on these experiences is important. We also look at, we go through and talk about some of the barriers to listening, like thinking about what you want to say next is a common one, having other things on your mind. And so kind of encouraging people to think about what are your listening barriers, what gets in the way when you're trying to listen to others, and how can you start to think about addressing those and start to practice in a new way. So listening is a habit. It's something that you need to really practice. So just kind of getting that into that idea of, you're not going to change your listening overnight, but it's just being a little bit more mindful, trying out some different things, being more attentive to how you show up as a listener for others, and those experiences that you've had where others have listened to you well. And then also thinking some about the context, and like listening as a manager can be different than listening to someone who's dying. And, sometimes as a manager, you want to listen and take action and show that you've heard and followed through, or at least address, why you're not taking action on something. But yeah, just being there with a person and not needing to worry about, having the perfect thing to say, but just being there with them in that moment, if they need to be sad, just like being willing to be in that space with them.
And your training and all of these steps that they're taking, have you noticed, or has there been an improvement in like the volunteers and how they're able to help these patients?
Yeah, so we are trying to look at, after people have been deployed as volunteers, what kind of challenges do they run into? How has the training helped them? And trying to figure out how we can improve training, and build listening in a way that's really helping them to address these challenges that they end up facing as volunteers.
So from that, where kind of are you right now in your research with listening? Like kind of, yeah, where are you right now with it?
Well, with this project, we've collected some pre-post data with volunteers looking at mostly the way that they think about listening. So does there's Avi Kluger, who I mentioned earlier, has done some work on listening schema and the belief in listening. and how, training can help with address the belief that listening itself matters and that you don't have to have the perfect thing to say, or you don't have to take action, these kinds of things, but just listening can be enough to potentially change someone's trajectory and to help them in ways that you might not think that just listening to a person could help. So looking at that belief in listening, and does that change through training? And we've found some preliminary evidence with a small sample that does change. And then looking at, how does that help and how does it inform the way that people listen? If they do believe that listening is enough, then that might change and help them relax when they're actually sitting there with someone who's palliative or someone who's grieving a loss, to just be there and not worry so much about having the perfect thing to say, that kind of thing. So that's some of what we're looking at next, is how does that impact them in those moments when they're in those conversations. And then, also doing some focus groups with people who've gone through listening training, and now they're deployed as volunteers, and finding out, what's still coming up for them.
Yeah, okay. It's come up a couple times now where being in that moment and not knowing what to say and just kind of like being there to listen. Like, would you have any advice for people? Because I know, like, I've been in a few of those situations myself, and it is hard because you want to say something, but you don't want to say the wrong thing, and you don't know what to say. Is sometimes just not saying anything and just being there better than trying to say something?
Yeah, absolutely. Often we're afraid of silence and we feel like we need to speak and fill the gap. And, but recognizing that silence is okay and can be beneficial. And actually, a lot of people just generally need some silence and some time to think. So when people are constantly filling the silence, it's not always helpful. Yesterday, one of my colleagues in the Department of Management and Organizations, we had a celebration of life for him. He unfortunately passed away last week after battling brain cancer. And he was, yeah, thank you. He was beloved by colleagues in our department, by students. When I did my faculty orientation at MacEwan, there was a student panel, and one of the students was talking about Dr. Charles Keim and how he had been just so fundamentally impacted by his class. So anyway, a really special guy. And at the funeral, it was packed. There was a full house, unsurprisingly. And a lot of colleagues from the School of Business were there. And there was a group of us after, they dismissed people to go down to the luncheon. And a group of us just sat there before going downstairs and just held each other in silence. And it was really powerful, I'm getting emotional just thinking about it. Often there is that desire to, and some people especially want to fill the silence, and they never leave room for silence. And so I kind of expected that someone would be doing that, but none of us did. We just sat there and held each other and cried in silence. And, it was really special.
Oh, that sounds really beautiful. Sorry, I'm also getting emotional. Not that long ago, we lost a beloved faculty member in the communications department, Dr. Lucille Mazzo. And she also had that kind of same effect. Like, she was so well known, everybody loved her. And it was also like a really challenging situation. I had heard so many great things about her, and I was so excited to get to know her and to take one of her classes. And then all of a sudden, and it happened like nobody knew what was happening or anything. It was just one day she just wasn't there. And there was a lot of really hard conversations that a lot of people had. And I think it's so beautiful that you guys were able to have that moment of silence, because I do think silence can be very valuable. And I think you're right. I think a lot of people forget that silence is needed at certain times. Let's move on, because one of the other things that you mentioned a lot, especially before, in our little pre-interview, is you mentioned a lot about community. And I wanted to ask you how important community is to your research and how it's kind of incorporated into your research.
Yeah, well, also when I reached out about the volunteering, the part of that was just wanting that community connection. I mentioned when I was in my PhD program, I was building that sense of community and listening and having good access to good listeners and learning to listen to others in a way that I hadn't before. So everything was kind of coming together, and it just changed my world. Having that sense of community was so important. And I didn't have that for a while when I moved here. And so, yeah, that sense of community and the loneliness, being able to really connect with other people, it's so important, and sometimes our jobs take us places and life takes us places. And it's just really important to have that community and the people around, and I felt that really in a powerful way yesterday when we were all there together and, connecting on a level that we don't typically at work. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that answers your question or not.
No, that's perfect. I did have one last question for you, and it's, what advice would you give to our listeners, whether it be students, staff, faculty, or anybody else who may listen to this podcast? What is your one piece of advice you would give them?
Well, invest in listening abilities. A lot of the people in the palliative care volunteering space, a lot of them coming through to volunteer are in their 70s or 80s, and they have been listening all of their lives, but it still can be transformational to really kind of reflect on something that you've been doing and look at it through a new light and practice it in a different way. So we can all get better at listening. I certainly am not perfect as a listener. But again, the research has shown that it's important for just so many areas of life, for connecting, for being there for other people, for building those relationships, for building that sense of community, for job performance, for our emotional and well-being, for storytelling. As a podcast host, the way that you listen helps others to be able to open up and tell their story in a better way. There's research and theory on that. So just on a number of different levels. I'm the cheerleader for listening, but it's just so important. So just investing in that and, again, practicing, just learning to be present, putting away the devices and things and just trying to be there present with another person and not really worrying about what you need to say as a listener all the time.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing a little bit about your story and your research with us. We really enjoyed having you.
I really enjoyed being here. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. Well, that's all we have for today's episode of Research Recasted. If you want to support this podcast, you can visit Research Recasted on your favorite podcast platform to find new episodes every 2 weeks. Also, don't forget to check us out on Instagram at Research Recasted, where you can leave us a like, give us a follow, or send us any follow-up questions you may have from today's episode. This has been Research Recasted, a knowledge mobilization podcast, brought to you by the Office of Research Services and the Faculty of Fine Arts and Communications at MacEwan University.